relationships, and curious conversations. I'm Mandy Pallock, and I'm here with the one and only Paul Hastings.
Yay! I'm glad to be here too.
Woohoo! Paul is the host of the Compelled podcast, which unites real Christians and remarkable stories, and he uses gripping, immersive storytelling to bring Christian testimonies to life. And if you're not a dedicated listener of the Compelled podcast right now, I am convinced and sure that you will want to be by the end of this conversation with Paul. And Paul, when I think of you, I think of someone who is relentlessly curious. And I also think of someone who's a faith-filled connector, because you bring together these stories that might not get shared and you create a space where they can be shared with the world. And my favorite part about it, frankly, is really how normal the people that you feature are. You definitely feature these individuals that have gone through notable and really big things. But with that, you bring this idea that a story is worth sharing because it is your personal story. So we have so much to learn from you. I'm so excited you're here. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, also, Mandy. That's a great sales pitch, by the way. I should bring you to all the speaking things that I do, and oh, I'll just have Mandy introduce me because it sounds so much better than when I introduce myself. So that's great. I'm excited to see what I'm going to end up saying. This is going to be wonderful.
That's fantastic. Have Suitcase will travel.
That's right. That's right.
Paul, most listeners of this conversation series, they're mentors involved in life-to-life ministry and everyday conversations, everyday discipleship. And we're here to learn from visionaries like yourself on ways to actually build resilient relationships and to have curious conversations with those that God brings into our lives. And you host these types of conversations all the time in your podcast. And that's why we're so excited to learn from you. So as a first question, Paul, in your podcasting and in your life, what does hosting curious conversations look like for you?
Yeah, great question. And earlier, when I was thinking about our conversation we were going to have, I was kind of thinking how did I get started podcasting? Why did I do podcasting? Obviously, a big portion of it is questions, and I think it really goes back to as a kid, I was always kind of curious, just naturally curious about people and things. And as I became a teenager, I would strike up conversations with random people. I was kind of that annoying kid that if we were gathered at a big gathering, like a youth camp. This happened a few times. So there'd be a big youth camp, and we would all be waiting there for the speaker to show up. Like 200 kids, we're all just waiting there, just kind of killing time. And then I would just kind of get inside my head, I can't stand the silence, and I'd run up and take the mic, and I just start talking to this crowd of 200 kids, and I was only 17 or whatever, and I just do that for fun. I'd tell jokes or whatever, until the actual speaker got there, or until some leader was like, Paul, what are you doing, man? Get off the mic, And so I was just kind of that annoying kid who just liked to just make trouble or whatever. But I always loved to ask kids questions. And so when I was, I think around the same time, about 16 years old, 17 years old, I found that I was going to this national speech and debate tournament. And at this national speech and debate tournament, everyone's talking, but I brought along this little tape recorder. So in between the rounds, I was going up to random kids just my age, and I had this little tape recorder, like cassette tape, and I just, hey, tell me your most embarrassing memory. Tell me your most incredible story about your best debate round, whatever. And I was just interviewing these kids, and it was just it just came to me very naturally. I just wanted to ask people questions, and of course, I never re-listened to the audio. I never did anything with it, but just that idea of having an excuse to ask somebody about the extremes of their life, I just found that really appealing. And so then when I got older, probably 20, 21, 22, I realized that a great way to kind of start a conversation with anybody, even if you're checking out at your car rental place, or you're checking into a hotel, or you're getting checked out by the cashier at the grocery store, whatever, any random person that you met, you could always ask them hey, what do? You like it here? Hey, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen here? What's the craziest thing that ever happened to you? I remember one time I was checking out at the car rental in Nebraska. I was going to a friend's wedding, and I asked the car rental lady. We were downstairs at the bottom of this airport, and it was just this very cold, wintry day. There was snow outside, and I'm the only person down there. And she's taking forever to check me out. It was Enterprise or something, and trying to process my credit card. And we're waiting there, and we're waiting for minutes or something for this paperwork to finish transacting. And so I just asked her, hey, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen down here in this airport? Because she'd worked this job for 8 years, and she just looked at me. She said, well, you know what? One time I was here at the airport, and the sliding doors opened up, and a deer with antlers ran into the airport and was running through the terminal. And I was just like, what? This is Nebraska. What? And she, yeah. And this deer was like running around inside the airport. And finally, this one passenger decided he was going to be Mr. Macho, and he tries to tackle the deer, and instead he ends up getting kicked in the head, and the ER had to come and take him to the hospital. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And it was just a fun little moment where I could kind of establish rapport with this person and also walk away with a really interesting story to tell. And
Yes.
it was just a fun way to connect. Other ways that you might see this play out, though, is like, let's say you're meeting someone for the first time, but they're a visitor to church, and you could ask them random questions and learn new things about their lives. And then later on, you can lean into those conversations later on. It's a great way to start off with some laughs. Like, hey, man, remember when you told me such a, whatever happened this last time, kind of go around, whatever. So that's kind of how I got into storytelling, and that's how it really kind of plays out for me, even my life today, not professionally, but just as a one-to-one thing when I meet people. That's still a common question I'll ask them, like, what's the craziest thing that's ever happened to you in your bank? And you'll be surprised what you hear.
I absolutely love it. And I love this idea that you have this question ready and you are gonna ask it. What's the craziest thing that's happened to you this last week or today or here at this spot? And then you're just like anticipating these great stories and all because of a question. And then I love another thing that you mentioned was that you're kind of keeping track of it as you can so that maybe it will let you take that conversation deeper later as your relationship progresses.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that was interesting also was, I think as we talk with people and trying to how do you be like a curious personality?
Hmm.
Because that's a great part of having conversations with people. And an important part of that is just being aware that there are other ways to live life beyond your own context. So everyone grows up with a certain mom, a certain dad, a certain set of family values. It's true. Some people have really extremely different lives, but most Americans, for the most part, we've all had many of the same experiences. Like we all grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons. We all ate milk and cereal for breakfast. We all, we've all been to Walmart. We've all, you go to Walmart, and if you get more money, you go to Target, right? Like we all kind of had those similar experiences. If you live in Texas, you go to HEB instead, right? We've had these similar things. But what's really intriguing is when you meet someone with a radically different world experience than you. So one of the things that I really appreciate is international travel, because it's an opportunity to go to another country and meet someone who's had a totally, completely different way of living life. And what they value is going to be different. How they approach life is going to be different. How they solve problems is going to be different. I remember when I was probably 21, I went to Thailand for 40 days. I was by myself. I had some family over there, but some of them spoke English, some of them did not. And for a portion of the trip, I was just traveling with non-English speaking family who only spoke Thai. And I only knew like 50 words in Thai. And so I was just, rapidly trying to read through my guidebook, trying to understand like what is this word that they're saying? And then I try to say words because this is like before like phones and Google Translate. Nope, that was
For
not a
sure.
thing. No one had smartphones or anything like that. And I had just like this like a little dumb Nokia dumb phone, that I'm trying to like, text people in English, but they can only respond in time, and so but it was a great experience. And at one point I ended up living with my bachelor uncle, who was a
Hmm.
police chief in a small village in Thailand. And because he has a completely different set of, life experiences, one day he just asked me, like, hey Paul, would you like to go on drug raid? And he invited me to go with him while they hunted down methamphetamines.
Hmm.
And because this is Thailand and it's not America, it's just like third world country. There's no paperwork, there's no nothing, and so I just showed up on this drug raid with him. It's just me and like 15 other police officers, and we were like going door to door into people's homes and like looking through all their stuff or whatever. We found drugs, and everyone else had guns. I only had a camera. Everyone else had like bulletproof vests. I had a T-shirt, and I turned out okay, right? But it's an incredible memory that I could just walk away with. And like, as I share this with my cousins in America, they're like, "What? You did what? That's crazy!" But it's a great experience that I was able to have and just realize, like, yeah, that's how people in Thailand, that's how they operate. It's another way to just kind of approach things. Here's one other example. In America, there's certain social things that are like incredibly taboo, right? Like you don't ask a woman her age or her weight.
Hmm.
You don't pick your nose in public. There's different things like that, right? But those are just social norms that are only American social norms. They're not
Hmm.
necessarily worldwide social norms. So if you go
Hmm.
to Hawaii, culturally, Hawaiians, being fat is a great sign of status and wealth and beauty, actually.
Hmm.
The same thing in Thailand. I was at church and the pastor was like full on picking his nose with his thumb for like a good 30 seconds while he's preaching. It was just like a normal just normal thing of life, you know. So I'm not saying like, oh, now I come back to America and I can just pick my nose wherever. Yeah, I don't do that with my podcast guests, right?
Yes.
But it was just a way to just kind of appreciate like there is way more to life beyond just my little borders.
Yes, you're recognizing that, whether you are having that conversation with someone at the rental car counter or in a foreign country, they're coming to this conversation with their own experiences, their own worldview, their own highs and lows, their own stories, and you're ready to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. So, Paul, when you're collecting stories for your podcast, Compelled, what types of stories and lives are you looking for?
You know, that's a great question. And typically, I'm looking for an experience that other people have not had.
Hmm.
Because I think those are the things that really stand out. And that's not to invalidate other people's life experiences, but the ones that really stick out, it's what is abnormal. So a great
Hmm.
example is we had a guest, she was from Romania, and she was an attorney defending Christians in court back in the 1980s when communism was still, was the dominant form of government over there.
Yeah.
And the government had been controlled by a single dictator, I think for about 30 years, Nicolae Ceausescu.
Mhm.
And this one lady, Virginia, she's Romanian, and she's an attorney, and she's a Christian attorney, and she's defending all these Christians in court and everything. And there was a lot of kind of international attention being directed at these human rights violations that she was exposing, and the BBC and the Voice of America were now covering these cases, and it was a real blight
Mhm.
on the government over there. And so one day she's at her office, and it's the end of the day. Everyone else has gone home, and a man walks into her law office. He closes the door. He pulls out a gun and says, "Shut up, sit down.
Mm.
I'm here to kill you."
Wow.
And he ends up being a trained assassin sent by the government,
Mhm.
not the mob, not the mafia. No, literally the actual government. This is their way
Mhm.
of dealing with a public nuisance. And he's just going to kill her in cold blood right there. And he even has the decency to say, "Sit down,
Mhm.
shut up. I'm here to kill you." Right. So
Mhm.
like he even dialogues with her like, "I'm here to kill you." Now, every story in Compelled is about how God shows up in incredible ways. And so I'm not going to tell you what happens in the story,
Gotta go check it
but
out.
that was a yes, go check it out. That's right. But when we heard that story, when I was carrying the pitch for this story, I was like, yes, this is an incredible story because chances are anyone that's listening to your video right now, no one's ever been in that scenario at all. But how would you respond? And what would go through your mind?
Mhm.
And these are the stretching limitations of the Christian faith. Like what are you going to do when you're being stretched to that level there? So
Mhm.
those are types of stories that we're looking for. There are other stories though, Mandy, that we look for, which are maybe what you would call more normal. So it's a more normal experience for someone in America. But how would they respond in that situation? So another example is that we had a husband and wife, and their son was hit by a car when he was 18, and it just tremendous brain damage.
Mm.
And they prayed fervently that the Lord would heal him, and he has not been healed. He
Mhm.
has now lived with his parents for the last 10 years, and they've provided 24/7 care for this guy for a decade now.
Mhm.
And there's not really any indications that he's going to get better or be healed. He can't take care of himself. He's kind of in this waking coma state.
Mhm.
And what's really intriguing, though, is this is just someone's real life, and this is real suffering that they're going through. And yet they've embraced the journey that God has given them. And this has been an opportunity for them to share the gospel with other people. And so
Yeah.
it's just a great conversation to be able to sit down with these folks, hear their story, and they are living a much more normal American life. There is no fairy tale ending, there's no miraculous healing. This is just real life, and real life gets really messy and gross and hard sometimes.
Mhm.
And yet that's what God calls us to live through. And so I
Mhm.
just find that story really compelling as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have your eye out for these moments that stand out. And then you're making the connection to your listeners that like as we all ask these universal questions, right? We're all asking, how am I going to respond when something terrible happens? And what if I'm really scared? Or what if something totally out of my control happens? And you're giving these examples that are extremes of the questions we're all asking. And I love that aspect of it.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. It's a way to kind of find how do we stretch to the extreme, and it
Uh-huh.
could take it to the logical conclusion or the destination that it's headed on. How do we stretch out what is our response going to be to suffering? Or what is our response going to be when we don't forgive? Or what is our response to XYZ? You can mention whatever the trial might be. How would we normally respond? And sometimes we could find these stories that are kind of at the extreme ends, but they also show the extreme power of Christ at work in people's lives. I'll give you one other example.
Do
We
it.
think about forgiveness. So we had a guest, and she was a missionary in the Philippines back in 2001. One night, she and her husband were kidnapped at gunpoint by a Muslim terrorist group. They took them into the jungles along with like 30 other hostages, and for the next year and a half, just their lives were just horrible. Some of the hostages were beheaded. There were gun battles with other people trying to rescue them and the Filipino military, but then the terrorists were using the hostages as like human shields and stuff. And there was starvation and there was dehydration. And every horrible, terrible thing that you could possibly think of totally happened. Now, of course, Gracia, that's her name, the guest here, Gracia and her husband, they're having this kind of crisis of faith. Really, Gracia was. It was this massive crisis of faith. Like, hey, God says that he loves me. I don't doubt that God's all powerful. I do believe he is. I just don't think he loves us, because there is no way that he would possibly let us be in this situation here. And so now let's back up. So that's a story. That's an angle, a question that sometimes some of us might face if we're having a different trial, like, oh, I lost my job. Oh, my child is sick, right? We might be questioning that, like, how could God love me in this situation? So let's fast forward. So now Gracia's in this terrible, horrible situation. She's been there for a year and a half. And finally, one day she tells her husband, like, I just don't believe that God loves us. And her husband turns to her and says, Gracia, you either have to believe all of the Bible is true or that none of the Bible is true. We cannot cherry pick and choose little bits and pieces. No. Either it's all true or it's not all true. So if you really do believe that God is real and the Bible are the words of God, you must also believe that he loves us. And if he does love us, then there is a reason for us to be in this situation. And whatever that reason may be, beats me, right? But that was kind of a turning point for her, where she really realized this was an opportunity that God had given her for whatever reason to share the gospel with with the fellow kidnappees, but also with their kidnappers as well. And I won't tell you what happens to the rest of the story, but again, it's this idea that these stories are it's a way to kind of tease out what are thought processes that we might already have in our heads that we're just not willing to go to there when it's our own story. But if it's someone else's story, we'll listen to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I love how, if we're talking about, well, what does it look like to be in a mentoring or a discipling relationship with someone? Maybe I have an amazing story to tell, right? And I can bring that story into that conversation or ask questions that will help someone else tell their story. But then maybe I just show up and I think, you know what? I heard this amazing story about this gal named Gracia, and this is what it was like. And so, she told her story, you tell her story. Now I can tell that story, and then others who hear it can also tell a story. And that's the beauty of a testimony, is that
Sure.
as it's channeled into, a one-on-one relationship, a discipleship conversation, good stuff's going to come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome.
Absolutely.
I love it. Hey, Paul, you are the king of active listening. So, what tips or tools might you have for us that help you actually actively listen to someone else's story?
That's a really tricky question there. So I don't know if I could call myself the king of active listening, but I've tried to grow in active listening. And I know in this interview, I'm doing all of the talking,
This is great.
which is it's normally the reverse when we do the podcast interviews. So
Yes.
one thing with the active listening, so a little context, when I do an interview, I'll normally sit down with a guest. We'll normally meet face to face in person. And we'll normally, and that's actually like a core concept of doing these in-person face-to-faces. There's a couple reasons for that. I think when you're doing active listening, there's also kind of this active observation that goes on as well. And so even though, you and I have cameras and the ability of the technology and stuff to see each other via video, it's not quite the same if you're in person.
Yeah.
A couple of reasons for that. One, we're still separated by several hundreds of miles, right? And so there still is a time delay. The internet can drop out, whatever. And there's these subtle social cues and noises that we make that are even subconscious that we may not necessarily pick up if we're doing a video call with each other. So that's one thing right there. If you can, try to meet the people face to face in person. Obviously, you can't do that for everybody.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing about active listening is like, hey, put yourself in an active spot. Second thing also, and we're so guilty of this as Americans, is, we'll have our phone with us, right? We'll have our phone. That's my wife, by the way. We'll have our phone and we're talking to somebody and we're like literally holding our phone as we're having this conversation.
Yes.
But I mean, that's not, because like, what if your phone starts ringing at the moment, right? Like, so that's a terrible idea. Same thing if I sit down to have lunch with somebody and I take my phone and I literally put it like right there on the table with us. Well, am I going to be checking? Yeah, I might check my phone and see what's happening if it rings or what. So again, another component, actively put your phone away.
Hmm.
Put your phone in airplane mode and then put it away. Do not look at it. I mean, that's huge. Don't touch it.
Yeah.
That's a huge part right there, just to be an active listener, participate in the conversation you're having. And finally, as we're talking, and this is something that we do with Compelled, is I try to normally not talk. I try to normally just ask them a question, and then I'll just listen, and then I'll nod along, and I'll be very expressive with my face. Now, if I'm having a conversation where I'm not recording the audio, then yeah, I'll wow, I'll make mouth, I'll make noises along with that too. But if it's just a video, if it's just a recording that I'm doing, and then I try not to say anything. I'm just like really expressive with my eyes. I'm nodding along, like you're doing right now. You're doing a great job of that right now because we're not cross contaminating each other's audio. So those are just a few tips that I picked up along the way.
Hmm. Hmm. That's fantastic. So be physically present, and then be mentally present, and then let your body language express your interest, but consider where it might be interrupting. So that kind
Sure.
of, yeah. So those are kind of, would you say those were your three thoughts there? Those were great.
That's yeah. I couldn't have said it even better. That's a great way
Excellent.
of consolidating it.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. So, so if we talk about intentional conversations, can you think of a mentor or someone in your life that had intentional conversations with you? Someone that made a difference for you? Um, did they use questions or not? What are words you might use to describe them?
That's a great question in that there. I would actually point out right now, I would say my wife is an incredible example of intentional questions for our children, actually. So I'm kind of twisting your question on
Do it.
in, and I'm really just going to point this for a moment. My wife is so intentional when she talks to her kids. Our kids are 7, 5, 3, and 1. And yet my wife, Sarah, is so, man, she has a lot of foresight in like how she asks them questions and thinking about things. I think she's subconsciously using the Socratic method, but I don't even think she necessarily consciously knows that's what she's doing. I think she's doing this intuitively. And I've talked to her about this before. And she just has a way of asking questions. And I can't even really duplicate it very well, actually. Sometimes I laugh and I'm like, Sarah, you should be the podcast host. And she's like, no, I don't want to be the podcast host. Another great way I see her do this is when we'll have like we're part of a church community group.
Hmm.
And so when we meet together as a community group, normally I'm asking questions of the community group. We lead a small group together. And so frequently I'll come to Sarah and I'll say, hey, what are some great questions we should ask from the sermon? Because I heard the whole sermon last week. But man, and I'll draft in some questions about like how I want to ask, and she'll just look at it and she'll like, no, we'll ask it like this. I'm like, wow, that's incredible. And when she's asking, I can only kind of tell you that what's happening is she's asking these questions, but we're pulling out people's emotions or their responses or how they should be behaving or how they should change their life
Yeah.
predicated on the truths that were exposited in the sermon.
Hmm.
So that's just a great example there. And yeah, someone that I admire her a lot. That's partially why I married her. But I had no idea she was so great at questions until we started having kids and started leading this community group. So it's just like, wow, the new surprises coming out of the woodwork here.
That's the best. I love it. How have you learned to host a self-welcoming conversation that invites people to really open up and tell their story?
Great question. There's a couple things, and these are just kind of practical things that we'll try to do at the podcast. So again, when I'm sitting down to interview someone, I'm capturing their life story of how Christ changed their life. So it might be a whole life story. It might just be like one day or one week of their life that they're retelling what happened. And we're really trying to get them to tell the story. I think you're able to relate better with people, and I'm able to better relate to them, and I think they can relate better to me when we exchange stories, because these are like life experiences, and like we can like sort of put each other into these shoes of someone else's life experience. We have so much more empathy for them. So one thing, I'll ask them some questions or whatever. But in the interview that we're doing for a podcast, the first question I'll typically ask is I'll just say like, hey, if your life is going to be turned into a movie, where would that start? What would be the first scene in it?
Oh,
Because I
nice.
think maybe as Americans we have enough context, like we've seen movies and maybe intuitively we sort of understand. Well, here's the dramatic point of where something changed. This is how the movie started, and this is that doesn't always work for every guest. It has to be a little bit different. So sometimes I ask that question, And then if you get the sense, okay, I don't think this is going the direction I need it to, or they're not catching the cues, I might ask them, hey, tell me a story of, that one time that blah, 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 right? And so I'll use that phrase, tell me the story
Yeah.
of blah, blah, blah. Again, trying to get them in the storytelling mode.
Hmm.
And as they tell their story, uh, frequently, as people tell their stories, they will also include their emotional responses to things, but sometimes they won't. And so that may be something you need to kind of tease into there, like, hey, so how did that make you feel? Because
Hmm.
that's a really important part to like make sure that we're not just reciting a bunch of facts and dates and literature and da, da. Instead, like, but how did that make you feel? What did you feel at that moment? What did you think about God at that moment? So that's another question I'll ask. And then another question I'll ask is maybe as we're wrapping up a conversation with somebody, again, they've just finished telling their story of being kidnapped in the Philippine jungles for, and then I'll ask, hey, if you could hop back in a time machine and you right now could travel back in time and visit yourself the day before you were going to be kidnapped,
Mm.
what would you tell yourself? And you can't give away that you're about to be kidnapped. But what would you tell yourself? What's the thing that you would say? Like what would you say? What would be the thing that you need to tell right now? Yeah, and frequently we'll get really interesting answers out of that because people stop and think and they're like, wow, I've never been asked that before. And they'll just kind of ponder and think a little bit. And sometimes there'll be some really rich nuggets as they kind of introspectively think because maybe they never really thought about that before.
Mhm.
And again, you never know exactly what kind of answers you're going to get, right? So it's a lot of it's just kind of being flexible and asking questions and kind of being curious and teasing around. I think probably your book, The Question Habit, probably has some great prompts in there actually about ways to kind of tease out deeper ideas from people.
Yeah, and I'm writing yours down because I think I want to pull them out. And as I'm listening to you, I hear that you're not I'm going to ask this one question, and if I don't get the response that's precisely like the one I want, then the conversation is over. You're kind of exploring and you're asking one question and then you're willing to come at it from a different direction if it doesn't land. And like really your goal is what's going to help this person share their experience and share their heart. And that's the beautiful goal in these types of conversations that you're so good at.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I really think it's this idea of like when they start telling a story and if they can really put themselves back into the shoes of where they were previously, I
Yeah.
think naturally their emotions will go there as well. And they'll be more likely and more prone to really sharing deeply and really feel things deeply. And then if it's not a podcast interview and you're just like connecting with someone one to one, friend to friend, I think there's an opportunity there where they may be, because they're being vulnerable, you have to be very careful to hold their fine china very delicately. But
Mhm.
also, there might be an opportunity there, a better opportunity for you to kind of like, hey, have you considered this or considered that? And because they're holding their heart right there, right next to you, kind of thing. I think there might be an opportunity that you can do deeper work normally than if everybody was just kind of hands off. That's
Mhm.
what I think. I don't know that for sure. That's what I think.
That's my personal experience. When I know I can trust someone with this part of my story, then I'm willing to have a conversation about this part of my story. And
Sure.
that's where it goes deeper. Yeah. Can you think of a time where you felt safe and secure like that as someone was asking you questions? What did that look like and feel like?
Yeah, great question there also. There was one time when my wife and I we had one daughter, one child, and our second child we were pregnant, and I think we were 16 weeks and we miscarried. Yeah,
Mm.
very hard, very difficult, big surprise. Had no expectation to miscarry, no family history of that, and so it was just really hard, really tough, and it was a very hard moment. And now, I'm like 7 years removed from that incident now, so it's easier for me to talk about. It's probably 5 to 7 years ago now whatever it was, my pastor, we have three pastors. We go to an incredible church here in Austin. One of our pastors came over that day,
Mhm.
and the day that we found out about the miscarriage, maybe it was the day after, I can't remember, but he came, and I remember, he came, and I don't remember what he asked or
Mhm.
what he said, but I just remembered he was just present. He was there. He didn't have his phone out. He was just there with us. He was there, and he drove an hour to get to our house because we live kind of out in the boonies away from our church. He drove an hour to just come and hang with us.
Mhm.
And there was no expectation for things. That's what he was just there.
Mhm.
And so I can't recall. Maybe he asked questions. Maybe he didn't. I don't remember, but I do remember he was there. He was
There.
very present. And that has just stuck out in my mind for the last 7 years or 5 years or whatever that it is, stuck out in my mind.
Hmm.
And I just try to make that a point. Like when I'm in a similar situation, like sometimes I recognize like I just need to be there. I don't need to talk because he didn't do a lot of talking. He was just there. And if we wanted to talk about whatever, we could talk about it. And he was just there. And man, that's always stuck up in my mind. Pastor Aaron, thank you, Pastor Aaron Mayfield. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Aaron. I love that because sometimes, we show up and we don't know what to say. And I'm like, I have nothing I can ask. I don't know what to say. I don't have a question. And I can just be there. And that presence is a beautiful, beautiful gift that we can share with someone. So as you were talking about stories, I was thinking back to a tradition that we started 2 years ago with our family at Christmas time, and we hosted a family-wide story slam. And so every person that could talk, we told them ahead of time and invited them to come be ready to share a 3-minute story. And it was my favorite thing of the year because, our 10-year-old came and told a story that stood out to him and it was fantastic. And, my dad came and told a story that was great. And my grandma came and told a story and it just included everyone in this multi-generational process of telling a story. Like we got a little Bluetooth microphone and a chair, but I loved how seeing what story is the 6-year-old going to pick out, and nobody knew what story she's going to sit on the stool and tell, but it was this beautiful moment of letting everyone come and tell a story and then everyone celebrate that story.
That is really cool. I love a story slam. And were these life stories from your life from the last year, or were these
They
like
were
made up fairy
they were
tales?
they were real stories, so they had to be, we just like a few guidelines were that it needed to be 3 minutes or less, that it needed to be a real story, and that was it.
Wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. We may do that this year. We may steal that. That's a
Do
great
it, do
idea.
it.
I
Yeah,
love
we're on
that.
the third annual now, and it's my favorite holiday tradition.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So at our house, at our family, we started an annual family film festival.
Oh, that's
So we
great.
are supposed at Christmas, everyone's supposed to bring the funniest family home video that they've got. Now, we've only done it for one Christmas, but it was
It's
fun
a
when we did
tradition.
it. So we'll have
Yes.
to see how the next one goes down. But yeah,
Yeah.
I love the story slam idea too. That's great too.
I love it. I love it. So, Paul, sometimes we learn best when something doesn't go well. Can you think about a time when you felt like you bombed an interview? And would you be willing to tell us about it? Because I'm wondering, sometimes we think, oh man, I've messed it up. I've messed up this conversation. I've messed up this relationship. So, what advice might you have for someone who feels like they're kind of starting over on this whole idea of having a conversation?
One time I did bomb an interview. It was so bad. But it was for different reasons. So what happened is we had a guest who had been at the Pentagon on
Mhm.
9/11 when the plane
Mm,
crashed into the
mm,
Pentagon.
mm.
And he had only been about 20 feet away from the impact site. And so when the plane crashed into the building, killed all of his friends, blew him to the other side of the room, he was covered in jet fuel and set ablaze like a candle. And he's dying. And he was not unconscious. He was conscious during the entire experience. And so now he's telling me the story of what happened. And I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it's a very difficult moment as he's recalling and telling this moment. And I'm listening, like I've got my podcast gear there and everything. And he's telling me, and he's in tears. I mean, this is very deep. And then suddenly I look down at my podcast equipment and I realized that the batteries had just died. And I realized we're no longer recording anything he says. And so I just realized like I have got to now stop him
Mhm.
in the middle of everything he's saying. And so we had to stop. And I had to like I'm trying to switch up the batteries as fast as I can. But like I
Mm.
mean, it was just first off, it was embarrassing. Secondly, you know, that emotion again. Like, how do you? Okay, now go back. You were crying. Resume. Get
Mhm.
yourself back into the emotions and the tears and the agony and ah. And yes, so that was just a incredibly humbling moment for me.
Mhm.
And I remember. I mean, I still remember even right now. I remember as I was getting there to interview him, I was thinking like, oh yeah. I need to replace the batteries.
Mhm.
Oh, too much time. I gotta keep going. Go. Oh
And there it
man,
was. Oh.
man, yeah. So that was bad. So that's one example of bombing the interview.
But then you went on and you had another conversation, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
We kept on going on, but we
Yep.
just kept on. We tried our best.
Yep.
We tried our
Yeah.
best, and it was still a great interview.
Yeah. Mhm.
And it's still one of my favorite interviews. It's a great
Absolutely.
story.
Absolutely.
Great story.
Well, Paul, as I'm listening to you share, thank you for sharing that. You know, it's easy to bring out like the stories that are successes. And here, like one of my takeaways from that is that you still had a conversation. And, you know, I think so many times as someone who wants these amazing conversations to happen and you know I'm like, oh look, is that a tear or is that watery eyes, like is that emotion, and like looking for that, but really recognizing that we come to these conversations with just open hands, and it's just being very willing to let the conversation be what the conversation is going to be, and sometimes it's going to result in this eye-watering moment, and some days you know we might get two or three syllables out of the preteen kid and that's the conversation. And I think to your point, it's being willing to keep coming back to a conversation, to keep coming back to a relationship that we know God is including us in, and keep asking those questions in a way that are, you know, that communicate safety and security and discipleship.
Sure, sure. I think sometimes you have to also lean into the awkwardness of it all. Sometimes,
Yes. What does that look
and
like?
sometimes you just have to lean into the awkward.
Yeah.
And what that could hypothetically look like. Let's say that there's someone that you're struggling and you've got some difficulty interpersonal communication with them that you think, man, I do not know what's going on here, but something's causing friction here, right? And you can either leave that as unresolved
Hmm.
and just continue kind of going around your life, and maybe that's breeding bitterness within somebody else, maybe not. I don't know, right? Or you could just like, sit down with them like, hey, can I can I just grab 2 minutes with you, 5 minutes, 20 minutes with you, whatever, like,
Hmm.
hey, can I ask you a really personal question? Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Is there some tension between us?
Hmm.
Because I don't know, it might be me, man. It might totally be me. And if that is, I would not be surprised if it is just me, because things like this have happened before. But I do feel blah 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 blah, that something is going on here, man. Do you feel that way? Is there something to that? And that you're just leaning into the awkward, right? And they might deny it. Maybe it really is all in my head. Maybe it really is in my head. Well, at least now I've been upfront with them, and I can just like say, dude, I am so sorry. I just want to have awareness that like this has been a struggle for me,
Hmm.
and I may need to ask you for forgiveness and for grace as I may continue to behave awkwardly around you, perhaps. I don't want that to happen.
Hmm.
And so that might be an example of like how you might lean into the awkward there.
Yeah.
That hypothetically.
It's a fantastic example. That's when I lean into the awkward, for me, it just looks like saying, "Hey, this is an awkward question, so here it is." You know, just acknowledge that and then keep moving forward because
Sure.
if we acknowledge it, then we can move forward. Can you speak to someone listening who might think, "Well, my testimony isn't worth sharing. My life story isn't that fascinating. I don't feel like I can make a difference." What might you have to say to someone who would be thinking those thoughts?
Okay, that's a great question there as well. And a couple thoughts that are sharing that. First off, especially when we think about our Christian testimonies. So you might be like, oh man, I was never a drug dealer. I was never in prison. Blah blah. I don't know why I should have ever share my testimony, kind of thing. Like I feel like a burden in front of other people because of that. What? First off, your testimony. I can almost certainly guarantee this. If you go and talk to anyone else who's had one of those crazy testimonies, like the drug dealer, the person who was kidnapped, the person who lost 10 children in a car wreck,
Hmm.
if you go and talk to them, they will say, oh, bro, I wish your testimony was my testimony. I would never wish this amount of suffering upon anybody else or on me.
Hmm.
I talked to a guy that I interviewed from San Antonio named Ken Freeman. He grew up in an abusive household, a horribly, horribly abusive home. Horrible things happened in his childhood. He became a believer. The Lord saved him from that incredibly. But he'll be the first to say, yeah, but I wish that as my children grew up, I don't wish this upon them at all. No way. And so it's a totally different mindset shift. So the testimony that you may have as the boring Christian, that is the testimony that they wish they had also. And really, I think it's more strongly, it's a testament of God's kindness to you. The second thing that I will share is incredibly, even though like, some people have these massive ups and downs and they're saved from Islam or or the New Age or whatever, and demonic oppression and whatever the crazy Christian testimony. But actually, their testimony and your testimony, the boring Christian, my testimony, are actually incredibly more similar than we would actually think about, because our stories are the same. We are all born, we are all doomed to hell and eternal damnation. And yet the God of the universe dies for our benefit and then freely offers us to become joint heirs with him. That is actually way crazier than anything else we just talked about. Anything else that might have happened in these little blips of like, no, the eternal story, it is the same story for all of those who've been called by the Lord. Yeah. And so I wouldn't get too hung up on about it. Testimonies are great for right now to share with other people. And sometimes it can be really helpful to just share like, hey, this is my testimony. It's a blessing from God. And I just want to testify that this is actually possible. So even though your story might be super messed up, maybe you can hope that your kids, and fight for that your kids will have the story that I have right now. That's what I would offer to folks like that.
I am a fan. I love it. So I know that everyone has been listening to your advice and they've set their phones aside, but I think that we should just invite everyone to get their phones and then go and subscribe to Compelled, because they are going to want to subscribe to the Compelled podcast. And Paul, how else do we connect with you after this?
Well, that's very kind of you, Mandy. Yeah. So if subscribing to Compelled, that's past tense. So Compelled, ED. You can go to our website, compelledpodcast.com. We also just launched a podcast network of a handful of other shows that are in the similar vein and production style as Compelled. They also use sound effects and music and narration to kind of bring these true life stories together. The name of the network is called Proclaim. So if you go to proclaim.fm, you'll be able to find other shows there as well.
Fantastic. We will check it out. Paul, thank you for having this conversation. Thanks for facilitating conversations yourself. And thanks for testifying to the truth and the goodness of what God is doing and the difference that it makes.